So thank you all for coming. The very observant among you might notice that I'm not Raphael, okay? Not Raphael, even Paolo, so even the wrong person. Because unfortunately Paolo's got COVID, so he's not going to make it here today. So I've been asked just to come and sort of stand in. So I apologise if I'm not sort of au fait with everything and everybody that's going to be here, but I will do my best. This afternoon we're going to be looking at the costs and benefits of decarbonisation, which for those of you at the session sort of 20 minutes ago, we were kind of looking a little bit at this at a very local level. So it was looking at, say, local government, local authorities, looking at costs and benefits, say things like social value creation that was happening at a local level, which had come from some interesting financial innovation that has happened. So I think today's going to be quite an interesting viewpoint that when we go from that very, very local micro level to something that perhaps is a little bit more macro and looking at much larger projects. So with no much ado, I'm going to bring you over to Dr. Raphael Slade from Imperial College London. He's going to do a bit more of an introductory speech, and then we're going to be hearing from Professor Paul Ekins from UCL, Mike Thompson from the Climate Change Committee, John Stenning from Cambridge Econometrics, and Rain Newton-Smith, who's Chief Economist at CBI. Some of those will be joining us online, and some will be here in person. So, Raphael, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm here because I've been deeply involved in the preparation of the IPCC Working Group 3 report, which came out in April and would lay the very bold claim to be kind of the world's most authoritative report on climate mitigation. I'll touch on that at the end. It shows how technology, lifestyles and investment come together, but also one of the elements that was a kind of a core part of coming across the report was aspects of cost-benefit analysis. So what I'm planning to do is kind of touch on how that was done in the report and some of the findings from that. But before I get into that, I just wanted to give you a very kind of quick snapshot which kind of sets the scene for the context under which the work on cost-benefit analysis was done. So firstly, it comes as no surprise that we're not on track. Carbon emissions are at the highest level ever. There's some slight good news in that the rate of growth of emissions is declining. We spoke a lot over the last couple of years about whether COVID was a tipping point or a point of inflection, but in actual fact, although there was a decrease in emissions, we bounced back pretty much within the year. We're still stuck in the era of fossil fuels. So again, one of the things we discuss a lot is the fact that coal power is coming offline in many places, but actually the proportion of coal is still large, has been increasing. And when we're talking about the sources of emissions, we are still talking about oil, gas, coal. And the carbon budget to stick to 1.5 degrees of warming with 50% probability is around 400 gigatons of carbon, currently emitting around about 40 a year. So simple calculation says that we will have blown our chances of meeting 1.5 within the next 10 years unless something radical happens. There's also been a huge amount of modelling which looks at what radical things could conceivably happen. So the top red line shows what the models on balance suggest for sticking with the currently implemented policies. If you stick with current policies and then start reducing carbon really rapidly from 2030, then you end up with a very steep trajectory in which you've got to ramp up technology. And there are other trajectories where you start reducing immediately, either to end up on a 1.5 path or a 2-degree path. But to stabilise at 1.5, you'd need to get to net zero around about 2050. To get to 2 degrees, it takes you a bit. You've got a little bit more time, a slightly higher carbon budget. You've got until around about 2070 to get there. But I think it really needs to be emphasised that the challenge of doing this is astronomical. But this does fit into the cost-benefit analysis kind of approach and also the way in which it's thought about within the report, because the report makes it clear that there is no single way of getting to net zero, and there is no sort of necessarily best way of doing so. So if you look at kind of the current carbon emissions, mostly coming from energy supply, transport, industry, buildings, land use, one of the things that we look at is alternative scenarios for what the system might look like at net zero. There are scenarios which have got a large amount of negative emissions, mostly afforestation, reforestation and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There are scenarios which have got incredibly low demand, so including behavioural change, including huge amounts of energy efficiency, including doing less. There are scenarios which include very large quantities of renewables. So when you're thinking about the cost-benefit analysis kind of framing, the question is, well, which of these paths do you want to pursue? Which do you think is actually going to be better? And the result will change according to the path that you choose. So the question that we've dealt with within the IPCC and the author team of kind of 270 plus authors who've been working on this has really been quite a active discussion, and it comes out and both within Working Group 3, which focuses on mitigation, but also within Working Group 2, which looks at adaptation, because it's also a kind of question which cuts across both working groups when you look at the costs and benefits. And there's a vocal lobby of scientists working on the report, and also people seeking to influence the report from governments, trying to say, well, we need to say, or we want to say, that mitigation and getting to 1.5 is always going to be the best option, and it's far better than living with the consequences. The result is somewhat less clear, and I'll kind of touch on the reasons why. So there's no simple answer. Let's get that out there straight away. But the report does look at this from a variety of different angles. So firstly, there's kind of the cost effectiveness. How much do different alternative pathways cost relative to one another? It looks at it through the kind of lens of sustainable development, equity, and also the kind of the aspects of technological feasibility and enabling conditions that you'd need to have to assume that would be in place. So firstly, looking at the cost effectiveness side of the argument, the starting point for this was a call to the community to submit scenarios for how decarbonisation pathways could be attained. Around about 3,000 plus scenarios submitted to the database, which is publicly available now if you want to go and have a look. And what we did is we divided these up into different categories, from C1 through to C8. The 1-2 category, you can't see the C1 label, I think, but it's completely bleached out. But C1 takes you to 1.5, C2 takes you to 2 degrees, C7, C8 are kind of business as usual, assuming no mitigation beyond what's in existing NDCs. So just want to kind of bear that categorisation in mind, because we then look at what the marginal abatement cost within the groups of scenarios is for these different categories. And there are a couple of different messages which come from this, which are perhaps not too surprising. Firstly, as you go from 2030 to 2100, the marginal cost of abatement goes from somewhere around $200, $300 per tonne up to around about $1,000 a tonne. The more aspirational you are in terms of the lower the temperature at which you want to stabilise, then the greater the marginal cost of carbon. So a C1 scenario, marginal cost of carbon is significantly greater than a C8 category, which take you to 3.54 degrees. one of the interesting things about this is if you do go for a 1.5 type scenario, then by the time you get to 2100, then the overall marginal cost actually starts to come down again relative to higher levels of warming. Because there are advantages in early implementation. But these scenarios, the vast majority of them don't look at the impacts of climate change on any aspect of the system or on welfare. So it's a fairly one-sided view of the costs of alternative strategies. Nevertheless, if you compare them to projections for how GDP may change or is forecast to change, GDP by 2100 is expected to at least double. So if that's your benchmark, then the overall costs of mitigation in terms of GDP loss are relatively small, around 2.6 to 4% GDP loss by 2050 for 1.5, 1.3 to 2.7 for 2050 for a 2-degree pathway. Again, this is slightly bleached out. So a C1 world kind of cuts across the chart around about here, which shows that if you do stick on a 1.5 type pathway, then there are huge regional disparities in terms of who is going to face the greatest cost. So there's an increase in GDP loss. There's a GDP loss for everybody, but for the EU, North America, and the Pacific, actually it's fairly small. Whereas for the Middle East, so Saudi Arabia, the oil-producing countries, Africa, Russia, you're looking at a GDP loss which is several times greater than in the EU, which also feeds into the kind of real-life politics of the negotiations which happens in the UNFCCC. So looking at the other side of the equation, so that's the estimate of the costs of pursuing mitigation strategy. Well, what about the benefits of avoided damages through from mitigation? And the results are fairly sketchy. I mean, there's work. This cuts across both Working Group 3 and Working Group 2, and there were only 5 studies in the end which we used for this, which pulled together information on or the different scenarios for the benefits in terms of global GDP from a particular sort of mitigation strategy. So if you go from 4 degrees to below 2, the percentage of global GDP is somewhere between sort of 15 to 5%. If you go from 3 to 2, it's less. If you go from below 2 degrees to below 1.5 degrees, then actually the projected benefits of going from 2 degrees to 1.5 are arguably within the noise of a fairly limited number of studies. So we did say that for 2 degrees C, economic benefits of avoiding climate change are greater than the costs, but there are an awful lot of caveats associated with this. Firstly, to a certain extent, you're comparing apples and oranges in terms of different models, different modelling frameworks. So they've got different assumptions within them, different counterfactuals. But overall, if you look across the board, it does look that there's a global benefit to mitigating below 2 degrees, but it's much less certain if you want to go below 1.5 degrees. The other way of looking at this was through a kind of a sustainable development lens. And again, the number of scenarios and the number of modelling runs which have attempted to do this are much more limited. But some of the work looked at the kind of population affected by different metrics and then assigned those to different sustainable development categories following the sustainable development goals. So you can see that if you were to go from, if you were to go to 1.5 rather than 3, then you see far fewer people affected by habitat degradation, crop yield losses, heat stress, things like health benefits of air pollution are all things which would be on the benefit of more extreme mitigation side of the balance. But again, we've got the caveats. Monetizing these impacts is very difficult, and trying to aggregate them across different kind of a global population where people got different value sets and are valuing different things is also inherently slightly political. But the broad message is that does seem to be that the more that you include, the greater the benefits appear to be. So if you do start looking at kind of welfare rather than GDP, then it looks as if there are greater benefits of mitigation. Welfare, poor people who become poorer don't affect GDP figures very much. Whereas if you're looking at welfare and you're valuing their right to a decent life, then you get quite different numbers. The other sort of piece of work, which with the final piece on the scenarios, just touches on how you do this. So a few of the scenario runs, and of the 3,000, again, this is really looking at a very small number. Tried to look at what happens with alternative policy scenarios, and came to the broad conclusion that if you put into the integrated assessment model a set of scenarios which really emphasises policy integration, sustainability aspects, you end up, for example, with a lot of bioenergy, but you avoid some of the land use conflicts, then overall you could have far fewer disbenefits through a kind of a sustainable, possibly utopian policy mix compared to a less utopian policy mix. The report also looks at the costs of technologies. Unsurprisingly, that's using a bottom-up assessment across all the different sectors which the IPCC Working Group 3 looks at, so industry, buildings, transport, energy, etc. The key findings here, which does feed into the kind of modelling, is really the biggest contributions are coming through solar, wind energy, the reduced conversion of natural ecosystems and methane reduction. So on the chart, the blue bars are where the costs are lower than the reference, and those are the kind of the easy wins, as it were. From an equity perspective, the report starts to get somewhat normative and starts talking about how things, despite the IPCC having a remit to be policy, to inform policy, but not to be policy prescriptive, it does start to become a little bit more prescriptive. So firstly, a lot of these pathways do imply very disruptive changes. And if you're in an oil exporting country, you could see the radical change in the kind of entire economic structure of that country. And the report asserts that these inequalities actually are one of the things which jeopardizes the implementation of effective mitigation policies. So if you really do want to go down this pathway, then you're going to have to do something about the inequalities. And one of the statements in the summary for policymakers is that ethics and equity can help address the uneven distribution of adverse impacts, which there is evidence that that's true, but the evidence tends to be at a fairly local and a fairly regional level. The report's also fairly optimistic about the application of just transition principles, and saying that tools such as participatory decision-making progress can be a way of effectively integrating some of these things into policy practice. And again, there are case studies, but they tend to be local, regional, or within a conurbation rather than within countries. So coming to the final couple of points, so in terms of feasibility and enabling conditions, we find that policy has been effective. If you look at kind of a reasonable counterfactual about where we would be now if we hadn't had things like the Kyoto Protocol, it's pretty compelling that there have been carbon savings. Difficult to put a precise number on that, though. Similarly with international cooperation. International cooperation does seem to be an important enabling condition for making rapid change. When it comes to policies, a lot of different enabling conditions are considered. The risk in terms of the overall transition is you tend to want to have all enabling conditions in all instances turned up to the absolute maximum. But if you're looking at individual case studies of where change has happened, most of them do fit within a kind of broad frame of there being a set of enabling conditions in place. And again, the report is quite challenging in terms of the kind of governance requirements that it sees are necessary. So you need capacity building, you need financial transfers. Involving people in a much more participatory way is seen as one way which that could work. I personally think that some of this, the report kind of moves from kind of evidence that's grounded in reality to kind of assertions of wouldn't it be nice if the world was, if everybody was nice to each other and we all decarbonised and decided everything collectively. But from the case studies that we looked at in the report, there is good evidence that some of these processes really can help make a difference. So back to the kind of the initial question is the mitigation cure better than the cost? So what we say is limiting warming to 2 degrees over the 20th century, yes, it's probably better. Climate damages have to be towards the low end of the range, and future damages have to be discounted unless future damages are discounted at high rates. Ambitious mitigation is more desirable if you include climate feedbacks. It's more desirable if you're looking at welfare rather than limited indicators like GDP. Also important caveats, how you do it is as important as what you try and do. You can't ignore equity and expect to be able to make changes like this unproblematically. And to make ambitious progress in terms of mitigation, you also need to have a high level of ambition in terms of putting the enabling conditions in place. So the funding, the technology transfer, all of the other measures which can help stimulate the change necessary. And I'll finish there, but I just wanted to have a final slide which kind of touched on the nature of the report. I mean, it's a political report which governments have bought into. So it's authoritative because the governments have been deeply involved in the process. But what this does mean is that when it comes to the summary of policymakers, it's slightly awkward in places. So, for example, there's no information in the summary of policymakers around finance transfers, or very little, because governments didn't want to see that. So when you're using the report, I wouldn't advocate trying to start at page 1 and to read it, but something like the summary of the policymakers can work very well as an index to go into the report and identify key bits of information, key chapters, which actually have got a really kind of useful resource for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're just about to move on to Professor Paul Eakins, who's at UCL. He'll be online. I just want to quickly point out, which is quite an interesting point, that it's actually come from the sort of local stuff that we had in the session earlier, and actually they've just repeated that decision-making processes, governance, capacity building, it's actually just crossed over from whether you're looking at something at a macro level to whether you're looking at something at a micro level. It was really interesting that was quite a conclusive thing that happened within your presentation as well. Are we ready? Do we have Paul online? Yes. Okay,
Yes.
if you pass you over to Paul.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to see whether I can make the online clicker work. I think I probably can. And thank you very much to Raphael for that introduction, which enables me to skip through the first few of my slides, because I had some context setting slides and he set the context admirably. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. Would have very much liked that, but various circumstances conspired against me, although I booked to come up personally. So I'm going to run through the early ones and start with my slide 6, taking as read the kind of context that Raphael mentioned. I'm particularly concerned at the moment about this particular set of issues because of the rash of papers in the literature that I'm coming across at the moment that are broadly advocating degrowth and saying that if the rich world wants to address climate change to the extent that I think it should, and that's meeting the 1.5 degree target, it will require rich countries to actually shrink their economies rather than grow them. I think this is both misguided and wrong, and actually very dangerous given the kinds of political tensions around the costs of decarbonisation which we see. And that's really what I want to talk about, perhaps being a bit provocative. So everything I kind of know about economic growth is that it comes from 3 basic sources. Obviously population growth, but probably more important for our purposes, investment in human as well as physical capital, and probably increasingly in natural capital, as it was Herman Daly a long time ago who said that that is now the scarce resource. And of course, absolutely critically, technical progress, turning non-resources into resources, finding better ways of doing things, and huge ranges of innovations in technologies, institutions, and governance. That's why the industrial age has been different to previous human ages that haven't experienced economic growth. And of course, there has been more investment in innovation and technical progress over the last 20 years than in all of previous human history. And the difficulty with this kind of world is that predictions about it tend to be very, very difficult, but also very, very wrong. And if I was doing this talk, if I'd been doing this talk 20 or 30 years ago, which I might easily have been, it would have been very difficult not to arrive at a conclusion that decarbonisation would reduce economic growth because of the sheer cost of the low carbon technologies. And we can see, looking at the second bullet point, that decarbonisation will reduce economic growth if zero carbon delivered energy is more expensive than fossil fuels, but there's lots of evidence now that suggests that it's not. That decarbonisation slows technical progress, but I see no reason at all for thinking why decarbonisation should slow technical progress. It seems to me just as likely to accelerate it. Or that the minerals required for decarbonisation become geologically or geopolitically scarce. And that's a major focus of my own research at the moment. And I'm not really decided on that because clearly there's a whole range of very new situations in play, not least the dire geopolitical situation that we see in the world today. But let's leave that one aside. And the one thing I can say with confidence is that these minerals are not geologically scarce, but the geopolitics is clearly very troubling. Now, the opportunities of emission reduction living in the world such as I've sketched is that there will be huge investment in new technologies if we're serious about this, and it's trillions per year. Some of that will substitute for what was going into fossil fuels anyway. I rather hope that not too much more goes into fossil fuels and that much more goes into the low carbon technologies than we'll need. But countries that lead on this, especially when they have traditions and industries that can learn from them quite quickly, will actually be at the forefront of this new industrial revolution. And we know what these technologies are already. if we're going to crack the climate problem. It's not going to be nuclear fusion, for example, but it is going to be renewables. It might be, and I was listening to the previous session on nuclear very interestedly, it might be nuclear, though I share a lot of the skepticism of some of the speakers about that. But that any country that's serious about this game should really get involved in industrial strategy in a big way. And one of my particular depressions about the present government in the UK is that we seem to have completely abandoned industrial strategy, apart from at the level of sort of vacuous political pronouncement rather than actual activity. This is a piece of work that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about. It was something we did for Sitra, which is the Finnish innovation agency, last year, using the macroeconomic model of E3 modeling in Athens, which does most of the macroeconomic model, or a lot of it, for the European Commission. And this was a pretty classic 1.5 degree energy scenario, 1.5 degree energy system scenario, linked to a small climate model that kept the temperature down to 1.5 by 2100, although it did overshoot quite a lot. And you can see there that gross world product kept growing right the way through to 2100, such that by 2100 it was something like 4 times the size of the economy in 2020. And you can see there that most of that in the later years was coming through technical progress, which I've talked a bit about, and investment. And that's another visual about that, which shows that the share of investment, the black, grew over that period, as one would expect, given the amount that will need to be invested. Just to check that you picked up that the scale of those bars varies dramatically across the x-axis, so we're not seeing accelerations in economic growth towards the end of the period. And this is very compatible and consistent with the 1.5 degree C report. I don't need to stress that. I think this from the IPCC, the dotted lines show that according to those IPCC 1.5 degree models, yes, mitigation to 1.5 degree C has a cost. So you can see the dotted lines in all the scenarios are slightly below the solid lines, which are the non-mitigation scenarios. But in no instance is there anything resembling degrowth or negative growth for the world as a whole. And I would just comment on what Raphael said, which is that those non-mitigation scenarios really are not fit for purpose because they do not include the effects of climate change. And it is absolutely clear to me that climate change is going to have a very dramatic effect on GDP if we don't get serious about doing something about it soon. There are lots of other estimates along those lines. I'm not going to spend any more time on those, but I would just like to spend a couple of minutes on the kind of objections to those model projections that come out of the degrowth literature, which, as I've said, I think are wrong. Sometimes it's said that we haven't seen the required rates of decarbonisation in the past, and I would simply respond to that we haven't tried. In other work that we've done that's been published, we've calculated that the average global carbon price is still negative. When you put together all the carbon taxes and prices and all the carbon subsidies that exist, we've still got an average global carbon price that is negative. Well, under those circumstances, I find it pretty remarkable that we have any kind of decarbonisation at all. The issue of rebound effects came up in an earlier session, and that perhaps they would undo environmental gains. That's purely a matter of policy. If you combine decarbonisation with a high carbon price, that would effectively choke off the rebound effect. And all the work that I've done on carbon taxation over the last 30 years has confirmed me in that view. Of course, these are just model projections, and all models are wrong. Some are useful, but they're inevitable. There's no other way of thinking rigorously about the future where you have complex interactions, and at least they have the advantage of making you be transparent about your assumptions. And of course, these models do assume economic growth along with other things because they identify that economic growth is the result of technical progress and investment. And there seems to be very little reason why technical progress and investment in the future shouldn't lead to economic growth, as it has in the past. And one criticism I saw in a paper recently was that the models don't take account of the full cost of integrating variable intermittent renewables. Well, actually they do. And I checked that with the IEA model. I checked that with the TMUCL model, and indeed the model that we were using, the primes model that we were using in the modeling that I've just showed you. So that doesn't seem to be valid. Of course, those costs might be wrong. And we had an earlier discussion in an earlier session at this conference about the difficulty of modeling these costs going forward. But the models do at least try to take them into account. So my conclusions really on this, that yes, there may be a cost of mitigation, but it's going to be relatively low. And I was interested that that was more or less Raphael's conclusion, 1 to 4% of GDP perhaps. These costs are low when you compare them to expenditures on health and insurance against risk. And the risks that we are taking with current levels of emissions are simply mind-boggling. If you go to the high cost estimates, where you really go into high levels of migration, high levels of loss of food production, then the risks are both existential and civilizational. And we ought to be prepared to undergo far greater costs than that. And if we take account the health co-benefits, bearing in mind that the use of fossil fuels tends to kill between 4 and 7 million people every year, and moves towards a circular economy, then we can reduce those risks further and get the benefits further. Of course, this is most true for fossil fuel importing countries. And I was very glad that Raphael mentioned the particular challenges facing the major fossil fuel exporters, Russia, Saudi Arabia, etc. And of course, those guys, if we do decarbonize, they are going to have to find other ways of earning a living. And that's going to be very difficult for them. The promise of renewables, if we can get those technologies right and balance the electricity system in all the ways that were discussed earlier, are enormous. And so my conclusion is that the investment in clean energy could be a major driver of development rather than a cost. And certainly it doesn't require anything resembling degrowth. So thanks very much for that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Paul. I am going to move swiftly on because time is upon us, and we're going to speak to Mike Thompson now of the Climate Change Committee. If everyone can keep an eye on time, that'd be really great. Thank you. Those of you presenting. Is he available?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me in the room?
We can hear you, yes.
Brilliant, great stuff. I've got some slides as well. I don't know if you can get them up there or if I'll share them direct. Oh, magic. Thank you. And does this button move them on? Amazing. Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm also sorry that I can't be there with you in person. This is the final week in finalising the Climate Committee's annual progress report to the UK Parliament on progress towards carbon budgets and net zero. So we're pretty busy down here in London. But I'm very glad that I can come and join you remotely to talk about the costs and benefits of net zero. There's an awful lot of noise around this issue, and there's also an awful lot of nonsense, as Paul has just hinted at. I think most notably the idea that net zero is a huge cost, and perhaps silliest of all, some of the calls we've seen in recent months saying that actually in the context of a fossil fuel price crisis, we can no longer afford to push for net zero. Frankly, some of the silliest arguments that you might see. And today I want to kind of look slightly beyond the traditional, fairly narrow focus on the costs of net zero and widen that out a bit, and particularly to get at what I think really matters. And that's kind of a bit beyond the work that the Climate Committee ourselves have done when we've been developing the UK's pathway to net zero. Probably most of you will be reasonably familiar with that work in the 6th carbon budget, the work from the Climate Committee as the independent advisor to the UK government. I'm going to do this in 4 short parts. First of all, I'll just recap quickly the estimates we've made of the resource costs, the kind of narrowly defined costs and the investments in shifting to a net zero economy. And then I'll talk about two of the problems with that: the failure really to capture innovation and the failure really to look beyond a pretty narrow casting of GDP. And then finally get at the other things that really matter, much more around distribution and fairness within society. So let's start with those costs and investments. And the big takeaway here is our analysis suggests pretty conclusively the costs are at most small. They could well be small positive, they could be small negative. We think central estimate small negative, but the overriding conclusion is that they are low. And you'll see this on here. If I just get this slide to draw, this is the percent GDP cost of the entire UK net zero programme. And this is the cumulative cost. This is not the cost per year. This is over 10 years, we will add something of the order 0.5% to prices across the economy if this is spread evenly through. So that clearly, in the context of what we're trying to achieve, is a pretty small cost. And of course, this is sure to be wrong as well. There's a load of assumptions behind this, most notably fossil fuel prices. If you were to plug in the current fossil fuel prices that we're seeing, or the ones we've seen over the last 6 months, kind of averaged out, well, actually, you'd see this reverse, and you'd see actually about a 0.5% benefit to GDP over that same period, reflecting that we really don't know this to any level of precision, and we shouldn't kid ourselves that we do. Further example of that is that we used to think that the cost was more like 1 to 2% of GDP. And indeed, not very long before that, we thought 1 to 2% of GDP was the cost for a much looser target, an 80% target, which is what we now are aiming for in the late 2030s. So we have a history of having got this wrong and been too conservative. And actually, the present time is suggesting we may well be continuing to do that. But of course, it's not felt as a kind of 0.5% of GDP spread across the economy. There's much more of a shift within the economy going on, most notably the shift from imports of fossil fuels into UK-based investment. And this is showing the UK investment programme, we think reaching about 50 billion a year by the early 2030s. That compares to about 400 billion across the economy as a whole. So a pretty substantial increase. And of course, for that, you get this massive saving in imported fossil fuel. So a big reduction in operating costs. And when we've come up with those 0.5% of GDP estimates, we're of course annualizing these and putting them together. That tells you immediately something about one of the very important things, which is cost of capital. The cost of capital that you apply to this investment program will make an enormous difference to the overall cost of the whole thing. And of course, we know in a very policy-driven transition, policy can do an awful lot to keep that cost of capital low. So that is one of the things that really matters. But this is quite a narrow picture, and I want to go on now to a much wider picture. And the point really here is that most of the other things that we think about, they tend to point to the net zero program being a beneficial one. There are maybe some things slightly on the downside, but most of the things we would point to tend to be upsides. Innovation, first. And I just wanted to pull this out because it's such an important part of the story. About the things that we used to think are expensive. And I've just pulled out here a snapshot of our report in 2008, the Climate Committee's first ever report looking at carbon targets. And you can see all these things that we thought were very expensive, almost everything apart from energy efficiency, we thought would be pretty expensive. But of course, as we've deployed these things, as the market has driven their costs down, as they've been backed by good policy, what we've seen actually is that the costs of them have fallen quite dramatically in the cases of renewables in particular, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, batteries as well, and as a result, electric vehicles. So that actually a lot of the kind of core parts of the transition we now think are actually money saving. Now, not everything. We still think that heating, we still think carbon capture, nuclear are likely to be expensive. And you might just notice those are things we've not done a lot of, so we haven't had a lot of chance to learn. And also they tend to be these chunkier things, not as modular, not as much scope for learning by doing as the others. But again, this is such an important theme. How do we maximize innovation? How do we maximize the reduction in cost, the increase in productivity in these new technologies that we're introducing? Really important to make sure there's a competitive market element there, but that also they're supported in the early years to get a rollout. So if I go on then to those wider costs and benefits that I mentioned, and just starting the picture here with the resource costs, this is what I show you already, that kind of 0.5% reduction in GDP, because we think that low carbon technologies are on average more expensive. But of course, we might well have that wrong. It may well be that actually even that cost isn't a real one, and there could be a genuine benefit. But taking it kind of as if they are expensive, we then have this big range of co-benefits. As we burn less fossil fuels, we also improve our air quality. As we cycle and we walk more, we improve health, we improve air quality, we improve the environment. As we change our diets to ones that are healthier, we improve health, etc. Very hard to work out exactly how much these are, much harder to quantify. Where we've done that before, we've thought actually this is probably worth something like 1% of GDP. It depends how you pursue the path, of course, but could easily knock off that resource cost. And then we get into a range of things that are kind of wider economic effects. And again, some of these we're able to quantify, but it's much more judgmental than the previous ones we talked about. So we might think about the extra benefit of shifting towards that extra investment program, UK-based activity. Some of the models suggest that could give you a 2 or even 3% boost to GDP. That's work in our 6th budget. But of course, some people will never believe that. Some people are just of a non-Keynesian school, and they don't think that this is really a genuine benefit. So got to take that with a pinch of salt. You could also have various other things around reduced volatility as we're less reliant on those fluctuating fossil fuel prices, perhaps greater opportunity for productivity growth. We know that fossil fuel extraction has tended to lose its productivity benefits in having to get to ever more difficult resources. No reason to think that should apply for solar, for batteries, for wind, etc. So potential for upsides there, maybe industrial opportunities for countries in that new, to grasp those new global markets as well. And then finally, of course, the biggest benefit, the reason we're doing all this, the avoided climate benefits, we've heard a bit about that already. Again, very, very difficult to quantify that meaningfully. It's very hard to capture, for instance, the very long tail end risks of new pests, new diseases coming in, the possibility of a COVID type outbreak. Very difficult to capture that in a meaningful way in a single number. I've quoted a figure from a recent study here, 5%, but you kind of have to put your finger in the air a bit, I think, with this. We know that the potential benefit is very large. And of course, then various uncertainties around these. Fossil fuel prices, I think we're seeing that the kind of upside benefit of net zero is probably larger than the downside there. People worry about, well, what if we implement policy badly? But probably more than that, what if the market completely outperforms the assumptions here? You know, this 0.5% is from a technocratic set of assumptions from the Climate Committee. I would expect the market to be able to go out there and blow that away. So again, the upside uncertainty probably more in our favor than the downside. So the overall point here, I guess, is we tend to focus on that bit we can quantify, but the other bits potentially are more important and larger, and they all tend to point in the same direction. They tend to be reasons to do net zero. Final bit then, I just want to kind of pick out some of the distributional effects, and I'll rattle through these. But in a sense, these are the things that really matter. This is where the transition will be felt much more than a -0.5% of GDP, I think. And you can think of some of the workers that we know. These industries will need more workers, need to create more jobs. That is in one sense a strain on the economy, but it is of course also an opportunity to boost employment in areas that need it, to bring new skills into changing areas. And there will also be downsides. The oil and gas sector, of course, will have to shrink. So probably will maintenance of vehicles as we shift to electric cars. There will be downsides as well, and we have to see these coming. We have to start to plan for them. And there'll also be a few industries where we need to do things differently, not necessarily more, not necessarily less, but with different skills, acting in different ways, people doing different things. And crucially, these changes will be happening in different ways in different parts of the country. So we need to think about how the costs and benefits are felt with a place sense, as well as thinking about the aggregate. And then final slide to say the cost side of this also could be very unevenly distributed. You've got a snapshot here from the Treasury's review, which shows you that most of the kind of analyses assume that heating will get more expensive, electricity may be a bit cheaper, and transport probably a lot cheaper. But what does that mean for a household that doesn't use a car, that maybe has quite a low occupancy rate and therefore a relatively high heating bill? They're going to be affected in a very different way to a home with 2 cars, with off-street parking, that's able to switch over and benefit from the electric vehicle transition. And of course, the way that we design policy, the subsidies, the grants, the regulations that we put through, those will make an awful lot of difference as to how this is felt at an individual level. And those differences are really the area where we think we need to be focusing in a world where we've made the decision, we're going to net zero, we're trying to tackle climate change. How do we do it in a way that is fair and felt as being fair across the piece? So I'll wrap up by saying, just recapping the 5 things that I think really do matter for this. 1 is, how do we maximize innovation in this journey? 2 is, how do we keep the cost of capital low, because this is investment heavy? 3, how do we make the most of the co-benefits? Very dependent on how we do our policy and the choices that we make, how much is there to have? 4, how do we share the costs and benefits widely and fairly? And 5, how do we protect the vulnerable in the transition, including those people whose jobs are adversely affected? We need good policy to determine all of those things and to get the most of it. We need good policy to get the best of the net zero transition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I'm going to move swiftly onwards because we get some really good presentations, but unfortunately are running out of time a little bit, so we might not get as many questions at the end. So we go swiftly on to John here from Cambridge Econometrics. Okay, thank you, John.
So hopefully I've got some slides. I've got a nice simple message, actually. I think over the course of the presentations went from Raphael saying, well, the costs to the economy look to be pretty unambiguously negative, to Paul saying, well, they might be negative, they might be positive, and then to Mike saying, well, actually, there's some work saying that they're positive. And I'm going to start off by unambiguously nailing my colours to the mast. I think the macroeconomic impacts of the transition are unambiguously positive. And that's the kind of the case I'm going to be making today and talking through. And that's not to say there aren't winners and losers. And I think Mike's talked really usefully about some of those winners and losers and how we have to make sure we have policy that allows us to mitigate the impacts on those that lose out in the transition and to maximise those benefits. But at a very macro, very high level, I'm going to make the case today that those macro level impacts look positive. And principally, the reason for this is all to do with the way we think about the economy and how the economy operates, and how ultimately, I think it was Paul talked about, models, and we use models for this kind of analysis. And there are, I think, fundamentally 2 ways you can think about the economy. This chart comes from a paper by McHugh et al. This brought together a team of different economists with different views on economics, on economic modelling, including some of the modellers that Paul said he'd worked with in Athens. And broadly, there are these 2 different ways we can think about the role of investment in the economy and the short-term and the long-term impact that investment has. What we see here is essentially one sort of positive view and one sort of, in the short term, kind of negative view. And this really hinges on your view of what the future economy looks like and how it's captured in these economic models. Now, I guess a lot of us in the room are familiar with energy system models, and energy system models are typically optimizing models, right? They're about trying to understand the least cost way of delivering a certain outcome. Now, there are a lot of economic models that have sort of a broadly similar structure to them, general equilibrium models. And they assume that in the medium, or at least in the long term, the economy reaches an equilibrium. This means that essentially markets all solve. So this means people lower their wage demands until they find work. It means that the market delivers a positive, a long-term sort of optimal trajectory for the economy. And that's what we see in the red, is this kind of view of investment, because this says, okay, well, if I'm investing in the low carbon transition, actually those resources have to be coming from somewhere else in the economy. I'm taking away from one area, and I'm then having investment in the low carbon transition, whether that's in industry, whether that's in households. And essentially, that view of sort of decarbonisation policy is that we're interfering with the efficient operation of the market, of the economy as a whole. And if we're doing that in the short term, all we can do is lead to less good outcomes, because the markets are solving, markets are operating, and so we're just making things worse. And then you have that in the short term, and then in the longer term, you have this question of, well, okay, it depends upon the balance, if you like. What's the long-term impacts of that policy? The most strict sort of optimization models would say, well, actually, if agents are able to see into the future, they're already investing in ways which optimize the long-term outcomes. So actually, in that case, you have a negative short-term outcome and a negative long-term outcome. Now that some of those are have less sort of strong assumptions in this area, might say, well, short-term investment can bring down technology costs, can lead to better long-term outcomes. So that's where you see the red line going sort of positive in the long term. But if we think of the economy as not an optimal system, or a system that is going to optimize itself in the long run, but actually as an imperfect system, where actually, as we've observed historically, there is systemic unemployment, there are resources that can be used that aren't being used, whether those are capital, whether those are labour, then actually we can take a very different view of investment. So in the short term, actually, money can be employed that's not currently being used, whether it's sitting in bank accounts broadly, but money can be used to bring in resources that aren't currently being employed. So used to bring people in, used to invest in capital equipment, to actually provide a short-term stimulus to the economy, to create jobs. And the ultimate sort of Keynesian example of this is paying a man to dig a hole and then fill it in again. That creates unemployment. Now, in that case, clearly, what you're doing is it has no long-term benefit. What you're essentially doing is borrowing from the future, because you're paying a man now, and then repaying that debt essentially over the long term. And the worst case green line here, the bottom green line here, is that kind of example, right? There's a short-term stimulus from spending this money, and then in the long term, well, I've got to pay back this money, no long-term benefit. In fact, we end up worse off in the long term. But actually, if that money is being used effectively, if it's being used to deliver us to a better long-term outcome, then what you can have instead is something that looks like the top green line here. So we have a short-term investment stimulus, creates economic activity, and takes us to a better place in the long run. And that's fundamentally, I think, where decarbonisation is going to take us, right? And Mike mentioned in his presentation that they had some work done which looked at this and quantified these positive economic benefits. We were the people that did that work, and actually that's what this chart represents. So this is a case in point. This was taking the balanced pathway from the CCC's 6th carbon budget, plugging it into our global macroeconomic model to understand what the impacts are of that on the UK economy. And what you see here is very much that kind of two-stage process. So there is, in the early years, this investment stimulus, a lot of additional resources being employed in the economy, people being employed, spending their wages in the economy, leading to these positive economic multiplier effects as well. And then in the long term, as Mike emphasised, what that does is it shifts us to an economy that has lower operating costs, these huge OPEX savings that you see in the CCC's modelling. And if you're able to deliver that, well, there are clear long-term efficiency gains then from being on that pathway, from people having lower cost cars, for example, to drive, or just having lower energy bills because they have more efficient homes, for example. So here we've got a case where we've got an investment stimulus. That money up front is then being used to create long-term benefits for the economy, a more efficient economy. And that leads to the kind of long-term positive economic outcomes that we see here. And that's really all I want to say. So I just want to move on to a few kind of conclusions from that. And that's that when we're thinking about the costs and benefits from the transition, We need to go beyond just the system level, this idea of optimization, and we need to optimize the outcomes that we're delivering. And we need to go beyond the micro and think about the macro, because the macro has important implications. There are, as Mike said and others have said, there are clearly winners and losers in the transition. But actually, if we know at a macro level there are positive outcomes, that implies also increased revenues for government, for example. It gives government the capability to fund policies that can help to address some of these losers in the transition. So it's really important that we have this sort of holistic whole economy view of the impact of decarbonisation. And fundamentally, at the macro level, what we talk about as a cost to one person is really a revenue or an income to somebody else. So, an investment cost, those capex costs that Mike talks about, well, actually, what that really means is paying a man to dig a hole and fill it in again. So there are positive impacts to those, even in the short term. And fundamentally, this is, I think, the line to take away. If we don't assume a perfect future, then we know that investments can improve the overall performance of the economy. And in particular, and as we see in this case of decarbonisation, when they lead to better long-term outcomes through doing things like lowering energy bills, lowering costs for consumers. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. And we're on to our final speaker of this very interesting session we've had so far, which again is online. And we'd like to speak to Ray Newton-Smith, who is the Chief Economist at CBI.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and hopefully you can hear me. And I'll try to be brief, and I think bring together a lot of threads that the other speakers have presented you with, and for a change from the usual, I won't be presenting slides, so hopefully that will bring a different flavour. And I know we've got Andy Burnham joining us at 3:45, so keen to leave some space for that, because I'm sure that'll be a great session. But look, I'm the Chief Economist at the CBI. We represent businesses of all shapes and sizes around the UK, and I think it probably really builds actually on where John was in terms, it's quite interesting. I think the business community in the UK is definitely in the camp of seeing the opportunities, I think, from the net zero transition. That's not to say that there aren't challenges, but I think it's interesting how lucky we are, I think, in the UK, that there's quite a big consensus. And obviously us as an organisation are trying to shape and lead that consensus that, we really need the government to act quicker on some of the policies we need to see to deliver the net zero transition, rather than, and I think this isn't true in all countries, sometimes, businesses are behind the curve. And I think it does speak actually to seeing some of the opportunities that are out there. And I think it also really picks up on what Mike talked about, as well as some of the co-benefits as well of the transition. And I think that's really come to the fore. So I just wanted to give a bit of a flavour of some of the policies I think businesses want to see, and in particular now when everyone's mind, I think, are really focused on this cost of living crisis in the UK. And we've obviously seen a devastating war in Ukraine, which has, just changed the game in so many ways, morally, economically, but certainly geopolitically. But I think what we're seeing across the business community is actually people are saying, let's use this opportunity to accelerate our transition towards renewable energy, to making our economy much more energy efficient. And I think that is certainly what we are picking up. So I think, and in some sense, the message we are saying is, let's use the crisis we're seeing as a moment to find those long-term solutions to really help that transition. And we certainly would push against the argument that, net zero is a cost and a distraction from growth in the economy. It's really about creating sustainable growth and opportunities within the UK, and people don't want that decarbonisation to be put on the back burner. Many of you in this audience, I don't need to say, will be familiar with the government's recent energy security strategy. And obviously that, I think the things that businesses liked about that is having clear targets on, on renewable energy in terms of electricity, and offshore wind, etc. But I think where it was weak was just on the sort of details of some of the policies that we need to actually deliver that. So I think that's where we are at, is getting more of those absolutely clear policy frameworks. And then the second area is really getting serious about energy efficiency. If you look at the buildings in the UK, we have some of the oldest, leakiest buildings, and the data shows that UK homes lose heat up to 3 times faster than more energy efficient homes in other countries like Germany. And I think the other big challenge we face in the UK is that the Future Home Standard, which doesn't come in for a couple of years, isn't strong enough. And actually many builders within the construction industry say we need to have clearer regulation because we shouldn't be in a position of actually building homes now that we know will need to be retrofitted over the next 5 to 10 years. We really need to ensure that those are heated from low carbon sources. And actually a lot of those technologies are proven, they're in use today. And so we don't have some of that technology uncertainty around how we heat our homes. So we just need to accelerate that. And I think one of the things that we're sort of saying is rather than having to have big interventions, understandably the Chancellor had to step in to help low-income households deal with some of the costs of heat and wider energy costs, given what's happened with energy bills this year. But rather than having to do that every now and again, we should really be investing the amount we know we need to do to retrofit our homes to have them better, to have better insulation. We should be spending £5 billion every year to make our homes more energy efficient. A lot of that will need to come from the private sector, but that needs some of the sort of market co-creation. So we should be looking at the moment, the government have something called Eco4, which is a measure where energy suppliers need to have targets to help low-income households make their homes more energy efficient. But the latest scheme of that hasn't been released yet. The government needs to get on and deliver that. And also we should have an Eco Plus, which moves up the income distribution and helps to get above just the very low income households having better insulated homes and homes indeed heated from renewable energy sources. So I think that's where we're really seeing businesses want to see that drive is improving energy efficiency. And I think the other thing I'd say is it isn't just about creating markets and investment in the UK. It's also thinking about our position in the global world. And I think there's a real sense that the UK can lead in the development of some of these technologies. Certainly we've, I think, led the world in terms of the governance around climate with the creation of the UK CCC and others, but we could be doing more to take advantage of some of the opportunity we could have to not just be the creators of low emission vehicles, but all the UK is an exporter mainly of trade and services, and so much of design, how you build cities. These are areas where the UK can really lead the world and export some of that know-how around the world. So it is really about, I think, gaining some of the market creation that is out there. So I think there's a real sense from the business community that now is the time to get on and deliver some of these policies. We obviously saw at the Glasgow Agreement, the Glasgow Financial Asset Alliance, where you had over 130 trillion of capital from asset managers from over 40 different countries coming to commit their capital to a net zero transition. But we really need to see the policies to unlock that. And I think it's been an interesting journey for the business community, particularly if I think back to it's almost 4 years ago now when the UK adopted its net zero target, and I think, you know, us and the wider business community were behind that, but I think it really has accelerated to now businesses seeing it as very critical to their businesses for us to deliver that transition and to see the policies we need to make that happen on the ground. And I think you can also see that illustrated, I think, in terms of the support for ultra low emission air zones or clean air zones, and some of the work that we have done at the CBI, looking at the benefits, the co-benefits of clean air. And, you know, we've shown that that can save, you know, millions of working days in terms of improved quality of life, people living longer. And that is not just a health benefit, but that also has a huge economic benefit. And I think more recently, we've now seen cities, Manchester actually is one of them, really leading the charge in terms of adopting those clean air zones. And that's seen as positive, and the business community behind that. So I think it shows a bit of the journey we've been on. And I thought, just to take us into questions, I did put a poll up there. So I don't know who has the magic wand in terms of making polls come up, but we can maybe load that up now. And it was really just to get a sense from all of you in the audience where you really think we need to see the policy levers to unlock this transition that we know we need to see. And I will pause there and open up to a more general discussion in the remaining minutes we have.
I don't know if the poll's working, but
it was only
no
just
idea. No idea.
So don't worry if it doesn't. It was really just saying, you know, is it about decarbonising our homes? Is it about a wider carbon price in the UK or otherwise?
No problem. There we go. So retrofits won, I think. Energy. Funny how we all think energy efficiency, and yet, you know, all the good seems to be not around in lots of policy documents, but very strange. Okay, thank you very much, Rain. Hopefully then we'll be going to questions. We've got just over 5 minutes, so hopefully we'll get a couple of questions in. Yeah, if you'd like to jump up, that'd be great. But I haven't got any questions yet. Well, as soon as I get some questions, I will...
Yeah, I can move this way.
No. Oh, thank you. There we go. Okay, so one of the sort of top question we've got here then is, have cost-benefit scenarios gone out beyond 2100? So are they front-loaded, and I suppose the benefits will carry on accumulating, you know, as time goes on, so you get these accumulations. So, you know, how far with scenarios, how far have you gone?
I think.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So in terms of the IPCC analysis, most scenarios are either going 2050 or 2100. There is a little bit of work which looks beyond that. I think one of the things that's challenging is that some of the options which allow you to get to net zero actually start saturating. So if you assume a very large amount of afforestation, then actually you do start saturating that reserve. So you will get a different picture and a different optimal split of technologies over a longer timescale than you would if you look over a medium timescale. But in terms of the analysis, I think there are so many assumptions embodied in these models that 2100 is already an incredible stretch of the imagination to get to, even if you're doing it in a systematic, rigorous and coordinated way.
Yeah, I think if in 1940 they'd been trying to predict what 2022 looked like, I'm not sure they would have got that close. So, yeah, I think that's a very good point. The other thing to say is that typically the integrated assessment models that are used by the IPCC and others include discount rates. So they essentially discount. The further you go into the future, the lower weight is placed on the costs and benefits that accrue out there. So, I mean, fundamentally, once you get beyond 2100, sort of just due to those discount rates, any sort of any costs and benefits are likely to have a small weighting in sort of the decisions we make now. at least according to those kind of modelling frameworks.
Anybody else want to reply to that one?
I just strongly agree that you're into fantasy land by 2100, and I think that we've got a 30-year transition in the UK now, and I think focusing on how do we do that, how do we make it work for everybody, that's where we need to focus our minds on.
And sort of following on from that really is what confidence levels do we have in mitigation costs, damage costs and co-benefits? Do our strategies reflect these confidence levels?
I think we shouldn't have too much confidence in any of them. I mean, Mike mentioned in his presentation, these are sort of have been historically fairly systemically overestimated, the mitigation costs, and actually technology costs are coming down quicker than anyone expected, and continue to come down even every time we try and say, well, maybe we should put a floor price in here. Actually, they continue to come below those. And in terms of the costs and benefits, I mean, there's huge uncertainties. Particularly when we get to these kind of wider benefits about the impact of air quality and how that translates to human health, because of the complexity and just because there's so much that fundamentally is very difficult to measure objectively. So I think there is huge uncertainty with all of these. I think what we're really trying to get at is broad messages, and I think the way that's been framed from the IPCC work is the right way to do this. It's not about to the third decimal point what any of these results are going to be, but about the broad trends that they represent.
If I can just come in on that, I agree with that, but it seems to me, to some extent, it's the wrong question. We should be focusing on risk. Risk is the absolutely key element here. And what's the downside and what's the upside risk of getting it wrong? Now, for me, if we get the downside risk on the cost of mitigation wrong, and we lose 4% of GDP instead of 0.5%, which is what Mike was saying, I think it might be a little more than that, but it's certainly within that range. Well, all right, that's a shame. I mean, that's actually what Brexit has cost us, according to the OBR. So we can think in those terms. If we get the downside risk wrong on climate change, and you look at what the scenarios are suggesting, that's the end of human civilization, if not the end of human existence. So the downside risk on not doing it and not getting it right is absolutely colossal. And therefore, to me, it's a complete no-brainer that we need to go off in this direction, even if the net costs were going to be many, many times greater than I think they will be. Because I think, CCC analysis, the kind of stuff you see all in the 1.5 degree report, and indeed in what Raphael put on the screen right at the beginning. I mean, this is a transition that we can do. There's no question of that if we put our mind to it. But if we don't do it, and we get the downside from the climate change, then we're in real trouble. And that's what we always have to bear in mind.
Yeah. I'm going to do a bit chair prerogative here and ask one question that isn't at the top. And it's a final question as well, so sorry about this. And it actually says, how could we quantify social cost and benefit? But I want to add to that and say, why should we? Why should we quantify social cost and benefit? Do we need to? And really, I'm going to ask everyone that question.
Maybe I'll jump in just because I think it builds actually on the previous question, and I think one of the challenges I understand from a modelling point of view why we've often we've had to sort of set aside the co-benefits of the transition, but I do think it's a mistake in terms of winning the public argument. And also, if anything, the pandemic has really shown us the interplay between health and between our economic well-being, right? Both in terms of mental and physical health. And actually, I think the science around what better air quality does for how long we live, how healthy we are, is actually pretty clear and unequivocal. I think where it is trickier, though, I think it is also very clear, is that lower electric vehicles create lower air pollution overall. I know you do need to look into how that is manufactured as well. So I think in some ways the mistake has been to leave the co-benefits too much to one side. And I think if anything, the pandemic has really shown us how we need to have well-being measures of health, measures of community, right? And measures of nature and biodiversity. We haven't touched on that too, but there's no doubt that some of the ways in which we tackle climate also have huge positives in terms of nature and biodiversity. And I think the problem we've had as economists is we sort of separated all of these things out too much, and we need to be bringing these together if we're going to win both the public argument and it's something I think that businesses see as well.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop it there. And I said, I do agree with you. I was just wondering, you know, why does it need to be quantified? I think is my question. Can't we just go, yeah, it's good. We know it's good. So why does it have to be given a value? Just a thought. Anyway, but thank you very, very much, everybody. It's been really, really fascinating. I really enjoyed all the presentations, and I'm just really sorry we didn't have any more time for discussion and questions afterwards. But if everybody, you've got about 30 seconds to get to Andy Burnham for those who want to leg it down the corridor. So yeah, thank you very much.